The last lesson discussed the perspective and approach of Unibase by DMAC to data entry. There have been other approaches. As I said before, there is nothing wrong with these other approaches. They simply address the fundamental problem with different tools and goals. One major consequence of these different approaches is that over time, the industry has created several unique ways of talking about the same thing. The purpose of this tutorial is to lay out the process of data entry using the terms and terminology which are familiar to Unibase. For some of you, this will be obvious stuff that is just shy of insulting your intelligence. For others, it will be a trip down memory lane. And for others still, it will seem an insane collection of entirely new words for common things, forming an impenetrable arcane jargon. But we will penetrate it, and you too will be a master of the arcane, which looks very good on the resume. Data capture, as I said before, is the practice of making information produced by humans useful to computers. But computers understand data, not information. The difference is information has relevance and purpose. Data usually arrives to the data capture specialist as documents like surveys, subscription cards, and forms. Forms, like the 1040 that haunts all of us at tax time, are the most common source of this data, and hence the word form is used to describe practically any source document. A form does not have to be a paper document. The most common alternative is a collection of scanned images. The specialty of data entry that involves typing data from scanned images into plain text is known as image entry. Unibase can do both, but image entry is a separate set of tutorials which require knowledge of data entry as a prerequisite. So, Unibase is for typing data into computers. The person who does the bulk of the typing is called the keyer, and the process is called keying. An additional step used to ensure accuracy is to key a file again, comparing it to the first attempt. This rekeying is called verifying. The source forms for data come in groups called batches, just like birds come in groups called flocks. Once the data in a batch is keyed by the keyer, it is stored on the computer. Language is flexible, so batching documents means turning a pile of forms into a number of batches of manageable size. But when you do a batch, you are keying a batch of forms onto the computer. You can call this stored data a batch also because of its close relationship to the batch of forms, but I won't. I will call it a file because otherwise it gets confusing. Getting this file is the primary focus of data entry, as it is data in a form usable by a computer. But it is not the complete purpose of data entry, as the whole point of making data usable by a computer is for the computer to use the data. Hence, after a file has been keyed, it is then output, which asks the computer to analyze the data in a file and produce a report that is friendly and readable to people, or, in some circumstances, friendly and readable to other programs, such as a metered mailing and label printing program for magazine subscriptions, a statistical number crunching mainframe for surveys, or whatever database software the IRS is using for 1040s these days. What are called forms when they are part of a batch are called records when they are part of a file. More technically, a record is the fundamental repeatable unit in a file. And while a single form usually makes a single record, this is not always true, and so the difference in terminology becomes important. A record generally has many fields, and a field is the smallest piece of data that can be manipulated as a single item. For example, a full name can be a field, but so could a first name. It depends on which is more important, using the first name without having to pull it out of the full name, or using the full name without having to paste it together from the first, last, and middle names. One purpose of Unibase is to make the job of keying forms and producing output as easy as possible. Hence, all the activity necessary for this process is called, appropriately, a job. Doing a job and keying a job mean the same thing as doing and keying a batch. There is a surprising amount of data required to do a job, although Unibase makes it very manageable. This data about the job of collecting data is called metadata, and the files which contain metadata are called metafiles. The task of creating these metafiles is the task of the user, which is usually a different person than the keyer. Unibase approaches metadata in a modular fashion, with the objective of not having to redefine something you've already defined elsewhere. This is why there are so many different types of metafile. And in the next tutorial, we will look at these different types of metafile after introducing you to the Unibase environment.